The thing that I've focused on most is what we think of as framing, how organizations frame what they do in such a way that they reach new audiences, or they heighten the salience of an issue, or different things like that. We found that, not surprisingly, the organizations, these social change organizations, are very deliberate about how they frame the issue that they work on, but they also frame their primary constituency. So their constituency is the people that the organization was designed to serve or mobilize or advocate for. And so we found both reframings about issue and about constituency. So let me give you a couple of examples. So there's an organization called Justice Now in California. They advocate on behalf of women in California's prisons. Two of the world's largest women's prisons are in California. And they both focus on kind of the immediate issues that these women have to deal with, but they also advocate on behalf of much broader change. So, for example, one issue that these women face is that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get decent medical care or decent health care in prison. And so Justice Now, as well as other organizations, work in various ways to try to get these women better health care. But Justice Now goes one step further, one big step further than the other organizations, because Justice Now is completely reframing the way people see prisons. So prisons are normally understood as the solutions to a problem, right? Prisons are a solution to crime. But Justice Now says, no, prisons are the problem. Prisons aren't the solution. Prisons themselves are the problem. And for example, in this issue with healthcare, what they argue is that prison, it's not just a matter of getting better medical coverage or health care for prisoners, although of course that's very important. It's the fact that fundamentally prisons themselves are unhealthy. They're unhealthy for the prisoners themselves. They're unhealthy for the families that these prisoners come from, and they're also unhealthy for the communities that these prisoners come from. So Justice Now, is very radically trying to transform the way we as a nation understand the prison system, and they actually work to abolish prisons. They take their inspiration from the slavery abolition movement, and their goal is to actually abolish prisons in this country. So there's another group called, it's the Gwychen Nation, and the Gwychen are an indigenous people who live in the very far north. Their land is partly in the United States, in Alaska, and partly in Canada, northern Canada. And they have spent years and years and decades trying to preserve the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR, right? And of course, we know generally the arguments that people use to support ANWR. It's about, they want to prevent environmental degradation, right? And they want to protect the animals that live there. And the Gwychen remind us that there are people living in this area too, and they frame the issue of economic development in that area as an issue of human rights. They say this is our land, we've had this land forever, and if you despoil the land or degrade this area, if you destroy the caribou population, which is a population that we are very dependent on, you're violating our human rights. And so what they've done is they've been able to reach a whole new category of potential supporters, because of course the environmental movement is already organizing environmentalists, and the animal welfare and the animal rights movement is already organizing people who are really committed to animals. But now there's a whole new population of people who kind of see themselves as human rights advocates, or people who really care about human rights. There's a whole new population of people that the Gwychen Nation can bring into the sphere of trying to protect ANWR and trying to protect the environment, the animals who live here, and of course the people who live there as well. So those are a couple of examples of how these organizations can really dramatically reframe the issues that they work on. But what we also found was that these organizations also reframe their constituents. And they reframe how external audiences see their constituents, and sometimes they also try to shape the way constituents see themselves. So one example of how they work to shape how external audiences see their constituents is, we can go back to Justice Now. And there was a period a few years ago where 9 women in California's prisons, 9 women died in an 8-week period. So, you know, it was a dramatic example of what the conditions are like for women in these prisons. And what Justice Now did was they used the opportunity to frame their constituents, in this case women in prison, as victims of human rights abuses. So again, trying to really dramatically change the way people think about women in prison. They're not criminals, right? That's how we often think about people in prison. They're criminals. No, they're actually victims of human rights abuses. They're victims of torture. That's really how they tried to reframe the way people saw these women in prison. There's an organization called the New Road Community Development Group, which is a low to middle income Black community in Virginia. And for various historical reasons, this particular community lacked things that many of us, we all take for granted, like indoor plumbing and other things like that. It was just, the area had kind of missed, you know, the kind of economic development that many of us take for granted. And so they were fighting to develop their area and get some basic things, some basic necessities that we all take for granted. And they found that their neighborhood was being stigmatized and kind of vilified as a low-income Black community. People were on welfare. People, you know, they were stigmatized or stereotyped as lazy and undeserving. And of course, this got the people in the New Road Community Development Group pretty angry. And they knew that everybody in the neighborhood worked. Everybody has a job, as they said it. So they ended up making a big sign, and they named all the people in the community and where they were working, what their jobs were. And they nailed this to a tree in a visible location, and apparently they got great press. And so, again, they're trying to reframe how an external audience sees their folks, right? They're not on welfare, they're not lazy, they're not somehow deserving of, you know, scorn. They're actually deserving of attention and respect. This is who we are. And I'll just give one other example, which is sometimes these organizations also encourage their constituents to change the way they see themselves. And one of the big examples of this is some of these organizations help their constituents see themselves as powerful. So some, and these organizations would be the first to say that this isn't always necessary, but in some cases there are folks who are poor, marginalized, they may be immigrants, they may be of color, and in various ways they feel like they lack the resources to make change. And these organizations say, really try to reshape the way these people see themselves and to see themselves as very powerful. And there's an organization called CASA of Maryland, that works with Latino and Latina immigrants primarily. And the director of the organization says that his constituents are co-authors of justice and makers of history. And he uses this language very deliberately to try to change the way, to encourage his folks, his constituents, to understand the power that they have. It's not necessarily about giving them power, it's about them rethinking what it means to be powerful and how they themselves actually can be much powerful than they might have previously believed.